They laughed when I choked on the glue. It wasn't just a joke to them. It was entertainment, a performance staged at my expense. And I sat there swallowing more than just the sticky liquid that stuck unpleasantly in my throat. I remember the sharp sting crawling up my esophagus, the bitter, unnatural taste that clung to my tongue like a warning. The boy, my grandson, grinned with the careless cruelty of youth, his eyes sparkling with mischief and disregard as he doubled over with laughter, clearly proud of his little stunt. My daughter stood nearby, arms crossed, a strained smile on her face that didn't reach her eyes. "He's just being a boy," she said, dismissing my coughs and my shocked silence as if it were nothing more than childish nonsense. But I knew better. That moment wasn't a prank. It was a line drawn in the sand, a declaration that I was no longer safe, even in the small sanctuary of my own family's home. I'm 81 now, living quietly in a small assisted living apartment where the walls are thin, but the peace is real, where the nurses don't mock and the days don't bring the sting of invisible wounds. But that wasn't always the case. Not long ago, I was still trying to belong in a house that had stopped wanting me, a house where I was tolerated as long as I was invisible and silent. It was a place where respect was rationed and love was conditional, given sparingly and withdrawn at the slightest inconvenience. I had come to live with my daughter and her family, hoping for connection, for moments of laughter that included me, for the warmth of a place I could call home. Instead, I found myself the subject of their amusement, their irritation, their endless tests of patience and endurance. The glue in the tea was the crescendo, but the notes had been playing softly, bitterly, for months. It started with little things you might not even notice if you weren't paying close attention, or if you didn't feel the sting of each slight so deeply. I remember the way he used to hide my dentures, just for fun, leaving me searching the kitchen floor, embarrassed and afraid to ask for help. I recall the whispered nicknames, whispered with cruel delight. NPC Grandma, Old Bot. Names that were jokes to the young, but daggers to me. The thermostat was lowered without explanation, the cold air a silent message that I was not welcome to complain or seek comfort. The house grew colder every day, not just in temperature, but in spirit. The laughter that once filled these rooms had grown thin and sharp, like shattered glass underfoot. My daughter stopped correcting her son's behavior, telling me instead to stop provoking him, while my son-in-law's advice was to keep the peace, even if it meant swallowing my dignity. I was caught in a silent war, fighting battles no one acknowledged, defending a place that didn't want me. I watched as my role in the family shrank from beloved grandmother to tolerated relic, a fixture to be dusted off when convenient and pushed aside when not. I didn't know how to speak up without sounding like a nag or a bitter old woman. I learned to swallow my pain as I swallowed the glue-tainted tea, to smile through the burning in my throat as if nothing had happened. But inside, I was breaking. I began to retreat, not because I wanted to, but because it was the only way to survive. I observed quietly, keeping my thoughts to myself, waiting for the right moment to act, for a crack in the walls that surrounded me. The kitchen table, where his laptop always sat open like a shrine to a world I was no longer part of, became the center of my quiet rebellion. I didn't touch the device at first. I simply watched it, an object both sacred and alien to me. He prized it more than anything, more than the company of those around him, more than respect or kindness. It was a symbol of everything that had shifted in our family. Their eyes glued to screens, their hearts locked behind passwords, and me left to sip bitter tea and swallow silence. But that day, After the glue incident, something inside me hardened. I no longer wanted to be the passive victim of their careless cruelty. I began to see myself as a woman who still had choices, who still had the power to reclaim her dignity, even if it meant crossing lines that had never before been crossed. I thought about leaving Honey on his laptop keyboard, an act small and symbolic, a reminder that sweetness could coat even bitterness if wielded with purpose. I imagined the chaos it would cause, the confusion and frustration, and I felt a strange surge of satisfaction. It was not revenge. It was a reclaiming of space, a statement that I was still here, still capable of being seen and heard, even if only through the sticky residue left behind. That's who I am now, a woman who refused to be invisible, who chose to speak without words, who walked away when the laughter became too loud and the love too conditional. And if you find yourself in a house where the glue tastes sweeter than the honey, remember this. Sometimes the smallest acts carry the greatest weight, and the quietest departures are the loudest declarations of self-worth. The moment the glue slipped into my tea was not the beginning of the end, but the undeniable signal that the end had already arrived long before, quietly and cruelly, in the small, everyday moments I'd been trying to ignore. That morning, when I raised the cup to my lips, I expected the familiar comfort of warmth and sweetness, the ritual that had grounded me through decades of loss and joy. But instead, there was the sticky resistance, the choking sensation that sent a jolt through my body and shattered the fragile calm I was trying to maintain. It was not an accident, not a careless mistake, but a deliberate act carried out with a smirk and an eager audience that did not include me. My grandson, barely 16, stood by the kitchen counter, eyes wide with glee, as if he had just won a game where I was the defeated prize. I sat silently, coughing and clearing my throat, watching the moment unfold as if it were a scene in someone else's life, a story told from a distance where I had no voice. My daughter, who should have stepped in to protect me, simply laughed and said, "It's just a prank, Mom. Don't take it so seriously." Her words hit me harder than the glue ever could. They weren't words of defense, but dismissal, a shield thrown up to protect a child who had long been allowed to cross lines without consequence. I looked at her and saw not concern, but exhaustion, a tiredness born from years of juggling her own struggles and choosing battles that didn't include me. The house, once a place where I had been the storyteller, the keeper of family memories, now felt like a stage where I was cast as the comic relief or the inconvenient relic. That morning was the catalyst, the moment when all the small injuries, the invisible wounds, converged into a clarity I could no longer deny. It was the moment I realized that I was not safe here, not in the way that matters. The glue in my tea was the loudest of many silences. After I rinsed my mouth, still tasting the bitterness that clung like a shadow, I withdrew to my room, the corners of the house seeming sharper, colder than before. I could hear the laughter echoing in the hallways, the murmurs of family members who had made peace with my presence only when I was quiet, invisible, and compliant. But I was neither quiet nor compliant anymore, not in my heart. That afternoon, I found myself reflecting on the months leading up to this moment, the subtle shifts that had eroded the respect and affection I once took for granted. The way my opinions were met with polite nods that quickly turned to dismissive gestures. The way my presence at the dinner table was acknowledged only when a chair needed to be filled, and quickly forgotten once the conversation turned to topics I was no longer part of. I thought about the Christmas when my favorite ornament was knocked from the tree by my grandson's careless elbow, and no one bothered to replace it or apologize. I remembered the birthday cards that arrived late, or not at all, the phone calls that never came, and the hugs that felt obligatory rather than warm. I remembered the day my daughter told me gently, almost as if sharing a secret, that I should try not to be such a burden. Those words echoed in my mind like a sentence carved into stone, heavy and impossible to ignore. The glue in my tea was the breaking point, but it was far from isolated. It was the symptom of years of neglect, of a family whose love had grown conditional and transactional. It was the moment I knew that staying silent would mean losing myself completely, and that walking away might be the only way to find peace. I started to gather my thoughts, my scattered hopes and fears, and began to plan. I didn't confront anyone that day. There was no shouting match, no dramatic scene. Instead, I packed a small bag with the essentials I could carry, folded a few worn clothes carefully, and tucked a faded photograph of my late husband into my wallet. I wrote a letter, not to blame, not to accuse, but to explain, though I wasn't sure if anyone would read it with open hearts. I told them that I loved them, but could no longer live in a house that no longer felt like home. That I needed to reclaim my dignity, even if it meant leaving behind the familiar, the expected, and the comfortable. The next morning, I woke early, the weight of my decision heavy on my chest, but lightened by the hope of freedom. I made a pot of tea, not glue-tainted this time, and sipped it slowly by the window, watching the first light of dawn spill across the quiet street. I knew the path ahead would be lonely and uncertain, filled with moments of doubt and pain, but also with the possibility of healing and rediscovery. That day, I left the house, the echoes of laughter fading behind me like a closing door, and stepped into a world where I was determined to be seen, not as a joke, a burden, or a shadow, but as a woman who had finally found the courage to stand up and walk away. The glue was gone, but the sting remained, a reminder of what I had endured and what I was determined to overcome. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a reclamation of self that I had long postponed. And though the road was uncertain, I knew one thing for certain. I would never again let anyone make me choke on the bitter taste of neglect disguised as affection. After the glue incident, things didn't improve. In fact, they only began to spiral into a slow, suffocating decline that crept into every corner of my days and every silence of the nights. The house I once entered with hope and love became an alien landscape, colder and more unwelcoming with each passing moment. It wasn't marked by grand confrontations or explosive arguments, but by the quiet erosion of my presence, a gradual but deliberate diminishing of who I was and what I mattered to those around me. The small acts of disrespect that had previously seemed isolated now formed a pattern, a web of neglect and dismissal that wrapped tighter around me until it was almost impossible to breathe without feeling the weight of their indifference. My grandson, the boy who had gleefully poisoned my tea, seemed to relish his newfound power, pushing boundaries with reckless abandon as if testing how far he could go before anyone stopped him. He would hide my glasses in the most absurd places, the freezer, inside a shoe, wedged between pages of a book I was trying to read, and then laugh when I searched in vain. He would call out to his friends from the hallway, whispering cruel jokes at my expense that they found hilarious. I could hear their laughter ripple through the walls, a sound that cut deeper than any harsh word. My daughter, once my ally, had shifted into a role of reluctant bystander, too tired or too overwhelmed to intervene. She told me repeatedly to just ignore it or don't make a fuss. Phrases that became like nails hammered into my heart, each one reinforcing my invisibility. She explained that teenagers are difficult, that boys test limits as part of growing up, but her excuses did nothing to soften the sting. My son-in-law was even less supportive, advising me to pick my battles and warning that confrontation would only make things worse. In their eyes, I was the troublemaker for daring to feel hurt, for wanting to be treated with the respect that should have been my birthright as their family elder. The thermostat in the house became a symbol of this slow fading away. Where once I could find warmth and comfort in the rooms I sat in, now I shivered beneath layers of sweaters and shawls, the chill creeping into my bones. They turned the heat down under the pretense of saving money, but I knew it was more than that. It was a quiet message, a reminder that I was not entitled to the same comforts as everyone else, that my needs were secondary, even inconvenient. My bedroom, once a cozy refuge filled with memories and familiar scents, was reduced to a storage space for out-of-season clothes and forgotten knickknacks. The door creaked when I opened it, the wallpaper peeling at the corners like the frayed edges of my own patience. I often found myself sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the faded floral patterns and wondering how I had come to be so utterly displaced in the very place I was supposed to be most cherished. Meals became another battleground, a place where my tastes and preferences were ignored or ridiculed. When I asked for a cup of tea made just so with a hint of honey and a dash of milk, I was met with eye rolls or a half-hearted attempt that left the drink bitter and cold. The dinner table, once the heart of our family, was now a place where I felt like a stranger watching a play in which I was not cast. Conversations would swirl around me, full of inside jokes and topics I was excluded from. My attempts to join in met with polite nods or dismissive glances. The laptop that my grandson prized so dearly became the altar where his attention was worshipped, the glow of the screen drawing him away from human connection and deeper into a world where my presence was irrelevant. I watched as he disappeared behind those blue lights, his laughter and mockery directed more at pixels than at me, and I felt a profound loneliness that no amount of family proximity could fill. The quiet cruelty extended beyond words and actions to the subtle erasures of my identity. Photographs were rearranged to exclude me. Birthday celebrations were held without mention or invitation, and my name was spoken only when necessary, often with a sigh or an eye roll. I was no longer a person, but a shadow, a background noise to be ignored or silenced. There was a moment when I realized I had stopped looking forward to visits or holidays. Instead of joy, there was apprehension. Instead of warmth, a creeping cold dread settled in my chest. The house was full of people, yet I felt profoundly alone. The hardest part was the way they treated me not as a human being deserving of respect, but as a problem to be managed, a burden to be tolerated until they could find a way to pass me off or shut me out entirely. I began to shrink myself, to speak less and smile more, hoping that invisibility might buy me peace. But peace never came. Instead, I grew bitter and quiet, retreating into memories and small rituals that no one disturbed. My morning tea, without glue, my walks around the block, the worn paperback I read in the evenings by lamplight. I thought often about my late husband and the life we had built together, the family we dreamed of, the love I thought would sustain us all through the years. But the present was a harsh contrast to those dreams. I was no longer the beloved matriarch, the keeper of stories and traditions, but a forgotten figure, pushed to the margins. In the moments when I was alone, I wept silently for the loss of connection and dignity, for the family I had raised and now felt estranged from. Yet, in those same moments, a quiet resolve began to grow within me. The glue in my tea was not just a cruel joke, it was a challenge, a demand for recognition, however painful. It sparked a shift, a recognition that if I did not stand up for myself, no one else would. I began to plan my small acts of resistance, the ways I might reclaim some fragment of power and respect in a house that had forgotten how to value me. But first, I had to survive the slow erosion of my presence, the quiet drowning in a sea of neglect and invisibility. This was the first escalation, the gradual tightening of a noose made not of rope but of everyday dismissals and silences, each one small but together, forming an unbearable weight. It was a test of endurance, and I was determined not to break. Even as they tried to erase me, I held on to the memory of who I was. A woman with a history, a life, a heart full of stories yet to be told. I clung to the hope that the day would come when I could reclaim my voice and my place, when the small acts of cruelty would no longer define my existence. Until then, I learned to navigate the cold spaces between their words, to read the silences, and find strength in the smallest gestures of kindness. An unexpected smile from a neighbor, the warmth of sunlight through the window, the taste of honey on my tongue, and I waited. I waited for the moment when I could no longer endure the slow unraveling, the first step toward reclaiming my dignity and my life. The moment I decided to act was not sudden, but slow, like the first thaw after a long winter, when the ice begins to crack beneath your feet, and the world shifts from frozen silence to the hesitant murmur of change. For months, I had lived in the shadow of their disregard, my presence diminished to a whisper in the crowded rooms where I once held sway with stories and laughter. The glue in my tea was the spark, but what followed was the slow awakening of something deeper within me, a refusal to be reduced, a determination to reclaim the dignity that had been chipped away piece by piece. I began to watch more closely, not just the actions of my grandson, but the rhythm of the household, the way the light moved through the rooms, the spaces where I was most and least tolerated. It was in those quiet observations that I found the keys to my small rebellion. I noticed the laptop, the shining center of my grandson's world, left open each afternoon on the dining table as if daring anyone to challenge its sanctity. It was not just a device, but a symbol of his youth, his power, and the distance growing between us. One day, I walked past it deliberately, running my fingers lightly over the smooth surface, imagining the sweetness of honey laid gently across the keyboard, a quiet counterpoint to the bitterness I had tasted so often. I did not act immediately. Instead, I allowed the thought to settle in my mind, a small seed of agency growing stronger with each passing hour. I found myself waking earlier, preparing my tea with care, savoring the warmth and the aroma as a small act of self-respect. I began to reclaim small corners of my day, taking walks in the neighborhood, feeling the sun on my face and the earth beneath my feet, reminding myself that I was still alive, still whole. With each step, the weight of neglect lifted a little, replaced by a quiet confidence that I had forgotten I possessed. I began to speak more, gently but firmly, reminding my daughter and son-in-law that I was not invisible, that my feelings mattered. These conversations were awkward at first, met with sighs or attempts to redirect the topic, but I persisted. I learned to hold my ground without anger, to use calm words that carried the strength of years lived fully and without apology. The house, though still cold and often indifferent, began to shift in small ways. My grandson, puzzled by the change in me, watched with wary eyes as I moved with more purpose and less hesitation. The honey on his laptop was not just a prank or an act of spite. It was a statement. When I finally did it, spooning a thin layer of golden sweetness across the keys, I felt a thrill not of vengeance, but of reclaiming space. I left the room quietly, knowing the chaos that would follow was inevitable, but necessary. The sticky mess disrupted his world just enough to make him pause, to see me not as the passive target of his jokes, but as someone who could push back. The confrontation that followed was tense, my daughter's voice sharp with frustration as she demanded explanations, and my own voice steady as I refused to apologize for asserting my dignity. That day marked a turning point. I realized that my power was not in grand gestures or loud protests, but in the small, deliberate acts that reminded them I was still here, still worthy of respect. I began to build a new rhythm in my life, one that included boundaries and self-care, walks in the park, afternoons spent reading or writing, and moments of quiet reflection. I reached out to a neighbor, an older woman who shared her stories and listened without judgment, becoming a small beacon of friendship and understanding. I found solace in these connections outside the family walls, a reminder that I was not alone, even when my own blood seemed distant. Each day I grew stronger, the layers of neglect peeling away like old paint, revealing the bright surface beneath. The glue in my tea, the cold thermostat, the whispered insults. They no longer defined me. Instead, I was a woman who had remembered her worth and was willing to fight for it in the quietest, most persistent ways. This was not a story of revenge, but of survival and awakening, a journey from invisibility to presence, from silence to voice. I was not the victim of their cruelty, but the architect of my own renewal. And as I moved forward, I carried with me the hope that one day they might see me not as a nuisance or a punchline, but as the woman I had always been, resilient, proud, and unyielding. The days that followed the honey on the laptop incident did not bring peace as I had hoped, but rather a tempest that tested every ounce of my resolve and clarity. The small act I had performed, meant as a gentle but unmistakable assertion of self-worth, was met with a storm of accusations, confusion, and anger that swept through the household like wildfire. My grandson, caught off guard by the sticky keys and the temporary loss of his digital world, did not weep or apologize. Instead, he reacted with defiance and theatrics, his outrage amplified by the echo chamber of his online friends. His mocking laughter returned, sharper and more cutting, aimed now not just at me, but at the very idea that I could resist or disrupt him in any way. My daughter, once caught between protecting her child and respecting me, seemed to crumble under the pressure, torn between loyalty and frustration. She confronted me with sharp words, her voice tight and brittle, accusing me of overreacting, of being difficult, of stirring trouble where there should have been none. It was a strange reversal where the victim was blamed for the chaos she sought only to end. My son-in-law, who had advised me to keep the peace, now positioned himself firmly against me, warning that my actions threatened to break the fragile balance of their family life. I was accused of undermining their authority, of causing unnecessary conflict that distracted from their priorities. Their voices, once filled with concern for my well-being, now carried an edge of exasperation and dismissal, as if I were a child throwing tantrums rather than an elder seeking respect. The house, which had felt cold and distant before, became a battleground where every glance, every word carried weight and consequence. I felt the walls closing in, the space for my dignity shrinking, until I realized that the place I had called home was no longer safe. Not emotionally, not spiritually. In the midst of this turmoil, I received a letter from my grandson, Kieran, the one who had not joined the chorus of mockery, but had always maintained a fragile thread of connection with me. His handwriting was hesitant but sincere, filled with concern and the tentative hope that I might still be reached beyond the walls they had built around me. He wrote about his confusion and sadness, about how much he missed me and wished I would come back. His words were a balm to my bruised heart, a reminder that not all bonds were broken, that love, however complicated, still flickered in unexpected places. But the letter also deepened the ache of separation, the painful recognition that even this fragile link was strained and uncertain. Around the same time, my daughter appeared at the cafe where I had begun working part-time, a place I had discovered by accident, but grown to cherish as a refugee from the storm at home. She came not with anger or reproach, but with a tentative offer of reconciliation, her voice soft and eyes searching for understanding. Yet beneath her words lingered the unspoken conditions and expectations that had defined our relationship for so long, the implicit demand that I return to the role she had assigned me, one of quiet compliance and invisibility. I listened but did not respond immediately, knowing that the path to healing would require more than apologies or promises. Then there was the visit from Lisa, my daughter-in-law, whose arrival in the cafe was both unexpected and unwelcome. She approached with the polite smile of a diplomat, but eyes that betrayed suspicion and calculation. Her words were measured, her tone carefully neutral as she spoke of family, of concern, of the need for me to reconsider my choices. But beneath the veneer of civility lay a subtle insistence on control, a demand that I submit to the narrative they had crafted about my disappearance and return. The tension between us was palpable, a collision of wills that left no room for compromise or tenderness. My refusal to engage on their terms only deepened the divide, solidifying my position outside the family circle they had enclosed so tightly. In the weeks that followed, a newspaper article surfaced, published by a local outlet, painting me as a missing matriarch, a vulnerable woman whose sudden departure had sparked worry and confusion. The article quoted Adam and Lisa extensively, their words carefully crafted to evoke sympathy while glossing over the deeper fractures and wounds that had led to this moment. I read it with a mixture of disbelief and bitter amusement, recognizing the performance of concern as a mask for control and judgment. The public spectacle of my disappearance was both humiliating and oddly empowering, a confirmation that my absence had been noticed, even if misunderstood. It forced me to confront the reality that my family had decided to write me out of their story, to recast me as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. The pressure intensified as legal representatives arrived, men in suits bearing letters and formal requests that sought to assert authority over my life and assets. They spoke of safety, responsibility, and the necessity of next steps, phrases laden with condescension and threat. I met them with quiet strength, refusing to be intimidated or coerced. I asserted my right to autonomy, my sound mind, and my chosen environment, making it clear that further attempts to control me would be met with legal resistance. This confrontation was the culmination of the slow buildup of tension, the moment when words and actions crystallized into an irreversible boundary. I was no longer willing to be the object of their plans and fears. I was a woman claiming her life on her own terms. Throughout this escalation, my connection with Kieran remained a beacon of hope and complexity. Our conversations, though limited by distance and circumstance, offered moments of genuine warmth and understanding. He spoke of his struggles and growth, of his longing for connection without pressure or judgment. I held on to these exchanges as a lifeline, a reminder that love could exist even in fractured families, that bonds could be nurtured on new ground. The mounting pressures from my immediate family contrasted sharply with the quiet support I found in unexpected places. Friends at the cafe, neighbors who offered kindness without questions, and the growing confidence within myself. This period was a crucible, testing my resilience and forcing me to redefine what family, respect, and belonging meant to me. It was a time of intense emotional labor, of navigating betrayal and love intertwined, and of discovering the strength to stand firm in the face of opposition. The second escalation was not merely about conflict, but about the transformation it sparked within me. A deepening awareness of my own worth and the courage to protect it. It was a reckoning that demanded I shed old roles and expectations and step into a new, uncertain future defined by self-respect and choice. Though the road was fraught with pain and loneliness, it was also illuminated by the possibility of renewal, a chance to build a life that honored my dignity and my needs. And as the storm raged around me, I found within myself a stillness and resolve that no amount of anger or control could extinguish. This was the turning point where the past's weight met the promise of freedom, and I chose to embrace the latter with open arms, knowing that true peace comes not from others, but from the fierce and quiet acceptance of oneself. The moment I decided to leave was not marked by drama or fanfare, but by a quiet certainty that settled deep in my bones, a knowing that I had reached the end of a long road paved with small betrayals and silent erasures. After the chaos over the honey on the laptop, the shouting, the accusations, the guilt trips thinly veiled as concern, I realized that no reconciliation could be built on such fractured ground. The house that once held the promise of family and belonging had become a prison where I was both inmate and invisible ghost. I packed my things with deliberate care, folding each piece of clothing like a small act of rebellion, tucking away photographs and mementos that told the story of a life I was not ready to leave behind. I gathered the money I had saved secretly, the little nest egg I had maintained despite years of giving and sacrifice, the funds that now represented my lifeline to freedom. I wrote letters, not angry or pleading, but firm and clear, addressed to those who had failed to see me, to the daughter who had dismissed my pain, to the grandson who had laughed at my suffering. I told them I was not coming back, that I was choosing a different path, one where I could walk with my head held high and my dignity intact. The day I left, I did not say goodbye. There were no tears or embraces, only the soft click of the door closing behind me, a sound heavy with finality and possibility. I carried with me not bitterness, but a deep, quiet peace, born of choosing myself over the shadows they cast. The world outside was both frightening and exhilarating, a vast unknown waiting to be claimed. I found a small apartment, modest and imperfect, but mine, a place where I could rearrange the furniture to suit my needs, where I could fill the rooms with the scents and sounds that brought me comfort. I bought myself a coat, a sturdy navy wool that fit like armor against the chill, a symbol of my renewed strength and independence. Each day, I built a new rhythm, morning walks that cleared the fog of old wounds, afternoons spent working at the cafe, where the hum of conversation and clatter of dishes became a soundtrack to my healing, evenings filled with books and quiet reflection. I began to reconnect with parts of myself I had long neglected, the dreams, the passions, the fierce spirit that had once carried me through wars and losses. The phone remained off for days, then weeks, as I distanced myself from the voices that had caused so much pain. When I finally turned it on, the screen was filled with missed calls and messages, frantic and pleading, but I did not answer. I was no longer a woman who could be summoned at will, whose life could be disrupted by guilt and manipulation. I reached out only on my own terms, to my grandson Kieran, the one who had never forgotten me, who had written letters and made calls that carried hope rather than blame. Our conversations were cautious but healing, a bridge built on mutual respect and unspoken forgiveness. One afternoon, he came to visit. A quiet man grown from the boy who once put glue in my tea. We spoke not of the past, but of the future, of books and birds, of the small joys that still held meaning. He did not ask me to return. I did not ask him to stay. We simply existed in the shared space of love renewed and boundaries respected. The climax of my journey was not a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet declaration, a letter sent to the lawyer representing my family. I wrote it with steady hands and a clear mind, stating unequivocally that I was of sound mind and acting of my own free will, that any further attempts to control or harass me would be met with legal action. It was a boundary drawn in ink, an assertion of autonomy that could not be ignored. This act was both a release and a reclaiming, a way of saying I was no longer their possession, to be managed, but a person with rights and agency. The days following that letter were calm, but charged with the weight of finality. I felt lighter, as if a burden I had carried for decades had finally been set down. The house was behind me, the future stretched out with possibilities I was only beginning to imagine. I found joy in small things. A cup of coffee made just right, a walk in the park, the smile of a stranger who saw me as I was, not as an inconvenience or a ghost. The scars of betrayal and neglect remained, but they no longer defined me. I was a woman reborn, standing firmly in her truth. The journey to this point had been long and painful, filled with moments of doubt and loneliness, but it had also been a testament to resilience and courage. I had chosen to walk away not out of anger, but out of love. Love for myself and the life I still deserved. And as I looked toward the horizon, I knew that this was only the beginning, that my story was still unfolding in ways I had yet to imagine. I had reclaimed my power, my voice, and my life, and nothing, not glue, not mockery, not dismissal, could take that away from me again. The quiet that settled over my life after I left was not the silence of loneliness, but the calm of reclaimed space, a gentle stillness where I could finally hear the rhythm of my own heart without the constant noise of dismissal and hurt. In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself sitting by the window of my small apartment, watching the world outside move on without me, and feeling, for the first time in many years, that I belonged, not to a family who had forgotten how to cherish me, but to myself. There was a peace in this belonging, a soft certainty that did not demand grand gestures or loud declarations, but simply was. I learned to savor the little things. The warmth of the sun on my face during morning walks, the rich aroma of coffee brewed just the way I liked it, the comfort of a well-worn book resting in my hands. These small pleasures became the threads that wove together a new life, one stitched not with the expectations of others, but with the quiet courage of self-respect. The loneliness I had feared did not take hold. Instead, I discovered a surprising companionship in the steady beat of my own footsteps, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the soft purring of the cat who adopted me from the neighbors. Porch, I reconnected with Kieran, my grandson who had never stopped reaching out, and our relationship blossomed on new terms, free from the shadows of the past and the demands of a fractured family. Our conversations were honest and unhurried, filled with laughter and stories that bridged years and healed wounds. He came to visit again, not as the boy who had caused me pain, but as a man who understood the complexities of love and forgiveness. We did not dwell on what had been lost, but celebrated what had been found, a connection forged in resilience and hope. The letters I once hesitated to send became a lifeline, messages of care and understanding that crossed the distance between us like gentle bridges. In time, I found community beyond blood ties, friends who valued me for who I was, an individual with a story, a voice, and a place in the world. I joined a book club, volunteered at the local library, and even started a small garden on my balcony, where I nurtured herbs and flowers, watching life bloom under my careful hands. These new connections nourished my spirit and reminded me that belonging is not always found in the families we are born into, but in the ones we choose to build. I thought often about the past, about the years spent in shadows and silence, but I no longer carried them as chains. Instead, they became chapters in a story of survival and transformation, lessons etched into my soul that taught me the value of self-love and the strength of setting boundaries. I kept a small journal, writing letters to myself that spoke of forgiveness, courage, and the beauty of second chances. In one, I wrote, "You waited so long for someone to save you. You forgot you were always the one holding the key. You didn't lose them. They let go. And you finally let go back." These words became a mantra, a gentle reminder that healing is not linear, but a journey of patience and grace. The world I had once feared now stretched before me with possibilities I had not dared to imagine. I began to dream again, not of reconciliation or return, but of a future defined by peace and presence. The wounds inflicted by those I loved remained, but they no longer dictated my worth or my story. I was free to write new chapters, to find joy in unexpected places, and to walk forward with the quiet strength of a woman who had reclaimed her life. And so, to any woman who finds herself at the edge of silence and invisibility, I offer this truth. It is never too late to choose yourself, to step away from the shadows cast by others and into the light of your own becoming. Your story is yours to tell, your life yours to live with dignity and grace. And when you do, come back and tell me. I'll be here, listening, ready to hold the space for your courage and your new beginning. This is my story, not one of perfect healing or simple answers, but of resilience and the enduring power of self-love. It is the story of a woman who found her voice not by shouting, but by speaking quietly and firmly in the face of neglect, who left behind the bitterness of past wounds to embrace a life of quiet strength and hope. This is the life I have built, one small step at a time, and it is enough. It was 3 months after I left when I saw him again, and I almost didn't recognize him. Not because he had changed in any obvious way. He was still tall for his age, shoulders slouched under the weight of a hoodie, hair falling into his eyes, but because his presence carried a hesitation I had never seen in him before. He stood at the edge of the cafe where I was working, one hand in his pocket, the other clutching something that looked like a paper bag, the kind you get from a bakery. I might have believed he was just another customer if it weren't for the way he kept glancing at me, quick and guilty, like someone about to confess to a crime they thought was unforgivable. The last time I had seen him, his voice was raised, his face twisted with indignation over the honey on his laptop. He had shouted something. What exactly, I can't recall, before slamming a door so hard I felt the tremor through my bones, and then I left. That was the memory fixed in my mind, the one I thought would be the final page of our story together. Yet here he was, in my space, the soft clink of ceramic cups around us, the smell of coffee and cinnamon in the air. He didn't sit right away. He hovered by the door until I nodded to him, a gesture that felt less like an invitation and more like a simple acknowledgement that I had seen him. Slowly, as if approaching a wild animal, he made his way to the table in the corner where I sat on my breaks. He placed the paper bag in front of me and slid into the seat opposite. "I didn't know if you still liked these," he said, voice low, as though speaking too loudly might scare off whatever fragile truce he hoped for. I opened the bag and found 2 still warm scones, the kind with currants that used to be my favorite. I didn't ask how he knew where to find them. I didn't ask who had told him where I worked. Those questions could wait, or maybe they didn't matter at all. "I haven't been fair," he said, eyes fixed on the table. I didn't think it mattered, the stuff I did. It was just, I don't know, jokes. But I've been thinking about it, and I know it wasn't funny to you. And the glue..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "That was cruel," I finished for him, not with venom, but with the steady clarity of someone who had replayed that day enough times to wear the sharp edges smooth. It was cruel, and it was dangerous. And it told me something I needed to know about how you saw me. He winced at that, and for a moment I thought he might get up and leave. But he stayed, shoulders tense, hands gripping the edge of the table as though anchoring himself in place. "I'm not here to make excuses," he said. I wanted to tell you I'm sorry. I know I can't undo it. But I thought maybe..." He stopped again, fumbling with the zipper of his hoodie. "I thought maybe I could do something for you now. Not as payback, like, not to erase it, but just something." I studied him for a long moment. In the months since I'd left, I had come to understand that forgiveness was not something you handed over like a wrapped gift. It wasn't a transaction, a neat exchange of apology for absolution. Forgiveness, if it came at all, had to be grown in soil both people tended. "You know I'm not just a victim in this story," I said quietly. "I left because I needed to, because I couldn't keep shrinking myself to fit into a place that didn't want me whole. You were part of the reason, yes, but not the whole of it. If you want to do something for me now, you have to understand that I don't need saving. I need respect. I need to be seen." He nodded, though his eyes were shiny with something he was trying hard to blink away. "I can do that," he said, and I believed that in that moment, he meant it. From the bag, I broke off a piece of the scone and set it on a napkin, sliding it across the table toward him. "Then start with this," I said. "Sit. Eat with me. Tell me about your life. Not the version for your friends, not the one you give to your parents. The real one." And he did. He told me about the trouble he'd gotten into at school, about the teacher who'd pulled him aside and asked if everything was okay at home, about the nights he stayed up too late because he couldn't quiet the noise in his head. He spoke in halting sentences at first, then in longer streams, as though the act of being listened to without judgment was unfamiliar but welcome. I didn't offer advice or scold him. I just listened, taking in the shape of his words and the spaces between them. Somewhere in the middle of his story, I realized I was no longer replaying the scene with the glue in my head. I was here, now, in the quiet hum of the cafe, sharing scones with a boy who had once made me feel small and was now, in his own clumsy way, trying to see me again. When our break was nearly over, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a small wooden box. The lid was rough and uneven, the sides a little crooked, but I could see the care in the way it had been sanded and the faint scent of pine rising from it. "Shop class," he said, a little embarrassed. "I thought you could keep your tea in it." "Or honey." I ran my fingers over the grain of the wood, feeling the imperfections like tiny signatures of his effort. "Honey," I said. "Yes, that would be fitting." He smiled then, really smiled, and for the first time in a long while, I felt that our story wasn't just about endings. It was also about beginnings, however small and tentative. When he left, I stayed at the table for a few minutes longer, the wooden box in front of me, warm from his hands. Outside, the world went on as usual. Cars passing, people hurrying by. But inside, something had shifted. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a seed. And I knew from everything I had learned that seeds, if given time and care, could grow into something worth keeping.